introduction. I'd like to thank everyone for being here. Like Craig said, I've been doing experimental art for about 10 years. This PowerPoint is mostly the PowerPoint I get in my thesis defense, and I've added a few slides of just kind of my personal background and experience with experimental archaeology. So for starters, what is experimental archaeology? It's a form of middle-range theory and aspect of processualism that allows us to bridge the gap between the past and the present. It's based on the assumption of uniformitarianism, so processes that were observable in the present operated in a similar manner in the past. And this is formulated through actualistic studies where we use authentic materials and conditions and matter shaped and used in a manner simulative of the past. So here's just a few, I just threw this up there because these are some of my favorite experiments, previous experiments that have gone on. It gives you an idea of what experimental archaeology can teach us. So Flanagan and Raymond, they made 30 and half to 30 Elko projectile points and threw them and watched the breaks and then resharpening and documented morphological change, and basically found that after a break, an Elko can change based on morphology alone and would be classified as a gate cliff, rose gate, or out of key. Timmis and Woods mimicked their experiment and also used 30 Elkos and found that the breaks would cause morphological change, and that's a great example of how an experiment that is well formulated with good materials and methods and well described can be replicated and produce similar results. Lafayette, she used obsidian western stem points for different tasks. She threw them at deer carcass, she cut up the deer carcass, and then found and compared, used micro and macroscopic analysis, and found that western stem points could have been or were multifunctional tools. And then finally, Praskeounis, she compared bifacial and amorphous cores, had an expert flint knapper make a whole bunch of flakes, and then used those flakes to cut denim, and found that the amorphous cores were able to produce as much or not more efficient. Sorry, the bifacial cores were not more efficient than the amorphous core. So there's just a little background on some of previous experiments, and I've modeled some of my experiments after theirs, especially Praskeounis. Here's just a handful of things that I've made personally. A wide variety of flakestone tools, groundstone, petroglyphs, pictographs, a duck decoy, many darts and arrows, atlatls. So it's one thing to just make replicated artifacts, to make a projectile point or something. But it's another thing entirely to half that into a foreshaft, make a main shaft, stick that into the main shaft, make an outlaw, and then throw it, and then watch how it breaks and how they're used. Here's just a few of the flakestone tools I've made. These are all kind of questions that I've come up with in my experience. So how were tools made? Was it a flake blank, or did it follow a biface trajectory? How were they used? Was it cutting, scraping, piercing, and then how long are they effective? That often depends. These are all just subjective observations that I've made. It depends on the material type and edge angle, and then what do the breaks and use where look like. So I've noticed, rounding on ridges, a lot of microchipping, and this is a beneficial for archaeologists, everyone out here, to actually do experimental archaeology, to get your hands on these things and figure out and understand the artifacts that we find in the ground. This is some of the groundstone that I've made. A couple of questions that I've come up with is, I've been thinking about, how long does it take to produce incipient versus smooth polish? Previously, before I did any experiments, I used to think it was a product of use. Prolonged use, you got smooth polish. Now I believe that it's more of a product of the hardness of the rock. And then like the depth of BRMs, it's pretty clear to me now that they're definitely manufactured to that depth, and then prolonged use, you get polished inside that. I wailed on that thing for about an hour with a rock hammer and hardly made a dent. Some pictographs that I made, and trying to think about what are the best binding agents. I've played around with saliva, pine pitch, and animal fat, and not surprisingly, animal fat works the best. The best rock surfaces are going to be smooth, not pitted, and how does exposure affect the elements? A lot of these wash away very quickly, and pictographs could have been much more prevalent in the past, and just based on preservation, we're not seeing them now. That's why we often find them in caves and rock shelters, protected alcoves. When it comes to manufacturing rock art, I've always been thinking, like, why don't we find rock art production tools at sites? And what would those look like? So I believe that a large triangular biface works the best. You should see a lot of microchipping and retouch on that distal end. And if it's indirect percussion, you should see some battering on the opposite edge. How are petroglyphs manufactured? I've tried scratching, direct percussion where you're just sitting there pecking, and indirect percussion. I found that scratching and direct percussion really don't get you anywhere. It doesn't penetrate the patina, and there's a lot of fatigue. It tires you out real quick, a lot of caloric expenditure. Whereas indirect percussion allows you to penetrate that patina, and it also makes much nicer petroglyphs. The direct percussion is very sloppy. And so something like that, buck up there at scratch, and after about 2 hours of direct percussion, I turned it into that. And then finally, another thing I've been thinking about is, like, in what context petroglyphs are manufactured. Sometimes you'll hear somebody say, they were made during a hunt, and I don't believe this now because pecking petroglyphs is extremely loud. You wouldn't be doing that while you're hunting. So that's just some previous experience that I had that helped me to formulate my experiments for my thesis, and which was an experimental program to evaluate the proposed functions of crescents from the western United States. So the function of crescents is unknown. There are more than 10 possible functions that have been proposed, and my ultimate research question was, what is the function of crescents? During the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene, large ice sheets covered most of Canada, and there were 42 glaciated mountain ranges in the Intermountain West. As the climate became warmer and drier, the large lakes were replaced by small lakes, and many valley bottoms continue to support productive marshes and wetlands. So that's the landscape that crescents occur in. During this time period, there are two distinct technologies on the landscape. You have your Clovis points that are lanceolate bifaces, then by overshot flaking and exhibit basal flutes. And they're often found with large bifaces, blades, cutting and scraping tools, and large mammals. And you have the Western stem tradition, which are lanceolate bifaces, sometimes shouldered, exhibit broad collateral flaking, and they're commonly found with crescents. And also associated with small to medium animals, aquatic resources, and mollusks. So really two distinct technologies that are co-occurring, different flaking types, different life ways. Crescents are commonly found with lithoprostating in terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene assemblages. They are most often found with Western stem points. Beck and Jones would say they are diagnostic of a Western stem toolkit. Radiocarbon dates indicate a primary period of use from about 12,000 to 9,000 years ago. But overall, they persist, especially the eccentric forms in California, to at least 7,000 years ago. They're commonly found near relic pluvial lakeshores and other littoral and coastal settings, and they're almost entirely absent in upland environments. And so it's pretty much a one-to-one correlation where if you have a whole bunch of crescents, there was a marsh or wetland or a lake there. And they're also not evenly distributed across the region and tend to be concentrated in large numbers in particular areas, like the Black Rock Desert, Tulare Lake, the Sunshine Locality, Channel Islands. They occur in the hundreds. Tatlock developed the first typology, and it's still commonly used today. You have Type 1 quarter moon crescent, which has a concave edge and a convex edge. Type 2 has a straight edge and a convex edge, and then to your Type 3 butterfly crescent, has broad wings and a prominent notch in the center. Fourth type is the eccentric crescents, which exhibit multiple notches and spurs, and there you have at least 18 subtypes. So generally 4 to 5 centimeters long. Length is I measure from tip to tip. Width is perpendicular to that of the midsection, and they're mostly bifacial, sometimes occur as unifacial or minimally worked flake blanks. Some researchers have called these crescentics or crescent scrapers and distinguish them from true crescents. Margin abrasion is common on the midsection. You get 60 to 80% exhibit some sort of margin abrasion, which is commonly also found on the bases of projectile points, presumably to grind that margin to prevent the sinew or the bindings from cutting it. Predominantly made from CCS, even in areas where obsidian is abundant and CCS is rare, like South Central Oregon, there still seems to be preferential selection for CCS. Up to 90% in some cases are always made from CCS. These fractures most commonly occur at the tips at midpoints. You get Burin fractures that originate at the tip and extend down the convex margin, and you'll get snaps at the midpoints. And they're often resharpened at the tips, which suggests that the tips are the business end of the tool. And residue analysis suggests rabbit and duck are the principal game animals associated with crescents. There have been very few studies. Pronghorn has popped up and deer a couple times, but it's unclear whether this was the material that was used, the crescent was used for, or if it was the materials used for hafting. So it could have been a sinew wrap or something. So, like I said earlier, at least 10 previous hypotheses. Transversely hafted projectile points, longitudinally hafted tools, cutting, slicing, and skinning implements, scrapers, peeling and stripping plants, multi-tools or general purpose tools, surgical or scarification, ornaments or amulets, attached to throwing sticks, and gorges. So a lot of ideas have been thrown out there without a whole lot of evidence to back many of these up. I focus on the more substantiated hypotheses, including use as transversely hafted projectile points, cutting and slicing implements, and scraping plants. And so I compared them to replicated technological alternatives for each of these tasks. So I used crescents and flakes, hafted and handheld for cutting. I used crescents and flakes, hafted and handheld for scraping plants. And then I used crescents and western stem points for use as projectiles. And the goal of my experiments was to actually generate some quantitative data to support or refute these hypotheses.
I'm glad you didn't go down the scarification route.
That's a hard one to test. So I formulated my experiments through a human behavioral ecology framework. So this can be applied to study the technological organization of tools by understanding behavior in terms of cost and benefits, an assumption that optimal behavioral alternatives will become more common over time, emphasis on energy and time, and addressing questions of artifact design and investment. So selection, and I was calling this natural selection, but it's really not nature that's doing the selection, it's culture. So I'm just sticking with the selection. It's fundamental to cost-benefit analyses. Technological evolution views tools as two competing technologies characterized by different combinations of manufacturing time, which is your input cost, and procurement rate, which is your benefits. So for a costly tool to be competitive, it must produce a higher rate of return, and a tool that produces a lower rate of return can only be justified by lower costs. So I use a combination of authentic and modern materials. I contracted a professional flint knapper to manufacture the replicated crescents. I drove to the Gentfield Chalcedony source, picked up a whole bunch of toolstone, which is what she made the crescents out of. I shipped 20 pounds of it to Australia and had an expert flint knapper make me some western stem points, and then I made the flakes. In total, there were 73 replicated stone tools used in the experiments, including 43 crescents, 4 of which were obsidian, 20 chalcedony flakes, and 10 chalcedony western stem points. On the left here is an example of some of my replicated crescents compared to prehistoric examples. So they were pretty close. I did a statistical analysis on metrics, and they generally fell in the range. They were a little thick, like a millimeter thick overall, but all within the range of prehistoric examples. On the left here are some of the replicated flakes I made and replica western stem points. Again, note that all made from the same material type, from the same source. For hafting, for the handheld tools, or the hafted tools I mean, crescents were hafted longitudinally and flakes were hafted longitudinally. I used an artificial sinew wrap with some Gorilla Glue. And then for the projectile experiment, crescents were hafted transversely tip up and tip down. And I used the artificial sinew with a mix of a pine pitch and charcoal mastic. For leather cutting, I got five rolls of split suede chrome tanned leather. I tacked them to a 50 by 50 centimeter frame, drew lines on them, and documented everything with video camera. I used 5 crescents and 5 flakes handheld, 5 crescents and 5 flakes hafted, and cut as much leather as I possibly could in 10-minute periods. Here's an example of that. This is a handheld crescent. Note that I'm not making much progress. And a handheld flake. A hafted crescent. A lot of caloric expenditure, a lot of fatigue in the hand.
You rested between experiments, right?
I did. 30 minutes between each experiment. And a hafted flake.
That's what I want.
That's the utility knife right there. There you go.
Exactly.
For the willow scraping experiment, I gathered willow stalks from the banks of the Truckee and Sacramento rivers. I trimmed the offshoot branches and then selected willow that was of a similar diameter. Again, same formula. I used 5 crescents and 5 flakes handheld, 5 crescents and 5 flakes hafted. Scraped as much willow as I possibly could in 10-minute periods. Here's a handheld crescent. Handheld flake.
I was interesting that you're a towards viewer to know that.
Do you have to do it left-handed?
Yeah. Hafted crescent here.
That makes it harder.
Well, I'm left. Hafted flake. For the projectile experiments, I had 5 Arundel cane dart main shafts that were straightened and heated over my stove, 4 of which were fletched, 1 was unfletched. I hafted all of the tools into 4 shafts that tapered, and they were inserted into the socketed main shafts. For targets, I use an international standard accuracy contest target that's used around the world to compare out scores. And I used a duck balloon attached to some paracord and a downrigger weight to drop out in the water for the skipping experiment. And these are a couple of outlaws at the outlaws. I also had professional outlaws or experts that were doing the throwing. So for the skipping experiment, trying to see if they would skip more frequently than western stem points. Darts were thrown a total of 80 times, including 12 crescents have to tip up 41 times, 8 crescents have to tip down 19 times, and 5 western stem points 20 times. And then I stood with the video camera by the target to document the number of skips. And again, I would have liked for a larger sample, but when it comes to experimental archaeology, you always want more time, and limited by other people and the time of day. So note the angle at which the darts are approaching is fairly obtuse. Getting excited. And also note that the darts float.
Good thing you had a professional.
For the accuracy experiment, darts were thrown a total of 90 times from 15 and 20 meters. Followed the same rules of the ISAC tournament contest. 7 crescents have to tip up, 7 crescents have to tip down, and 6 western stem points were each thrown 30 times. So then you count you mark your score. And then after the experiment, since they were only thrown at soft targets, you know, the balloon and hay bales, I wanted to get some breakage results, so we had him throw, this guy throw him at a piece of plywood. These are tip-up crescents.
Nice.
Yeah.
He's good.
Far away is he?
He's 15 probably. These are tip-down crescents. These are western stem points.
They've been doing that a lot, something like that?
Just for you to sit down on.
Okay, that's right.
Yeah, so there's a lot of text here, but the main thing to take away is that if crescents were used for cutting and slicing tasks, then I expect them to function more efficiently than unmodified flakes. If they don't function more efficiently than unmodified flakes, then they may not have been used for cutting and slicing. If they do, then they may have been used for cutting and slicing. If crescents were used to scrape and strip marsh plants, then I expect them to function more efficiently than unmodified flakes. If they do, then they may have been used to process marsh plants, and if they don't, then they may not have been used to process marsh plants. If crescents were used as projectiles to hunt waterfowl in water, I expected a functional advantage such as skipping. So if they skip more frequently than an alternative point type, then they may have offered a functional advantage, and if they don't, then they may not have. And then finally, if crescents were used to tip projectiles, then I expect them to score equally well to alternative point types. If they do not score equally well to western stem points, then they probably were not used to tip projectiles, and if they do, then they may have been used to tip projectiles. So the results, handheld, the flakes cut 61.1 centimeters per minute compared to the crescents, which only cut 11.6 centimeters per minute. And the hafted flakes cut 244.5 centimeters a minute compared to the hafted crescents, which only cut 42.2 centimeters per minute. Another thing to note is also that the flakes produced fairly clean, straight cuts compared to the crescents, which were very rough and ragged cuts. These results are statistically significant. Here's an example of that, showing that the handheld flakes still outperform the hafted crescents. And the other thing to take away from this is that hafting greatly increases your effectiveness. But it allows you more leverage and grip strength, and obviously it was at least 4 times more effective. The results of the willow scraping, the handheld crescents and flakes were equal. Both cut 20.7 or scraped 20.7 centimeters of willow, and the hafted flakes cut 30 centimeters or scraped 30 centimeters per minute compared to the hafted crescents, which only cut 24. But these results are not statistically significant. And here's showing that again, and just noting that you get a slight increase in effectiveness through hafting. For the skipping, nothing really skipped. The one skip I had was more like glide. It was with the unfletched dart. The fletching seemed to cause a lot of drag. So 7 hits, 1 skip with the tip-up crescents, 2 hits with tip down, and 1 hit with the western stem points. The accuracy experiment, they were all fairly equal. The western stem points were slightly more accurate at 7.2 compared to 6.83 and 6.27 for the tip down and tip up crescents respectively. And from 20 meters, the western stem points were slightly more accurate at 6.53 compared to 5.83 and 4.53 for the tip down and tip up crescents. These results are not statistically significant, but the thing to note again, this is some of the strongest evidence that I gathered from the whole experimental process was the breakage. So cutting and slicing got small bending and burin fractures at the tips, and all the crescents were complete or nearly complete. Willow scraping, there were no breaks, and all the crescents were complete, but they did have quite a bit of residue on their margins. Tip-up projectiles exhibit small and large bending and burin fractures at the tips and wings, and this is very similar to the archaeological patterns that we see. And then finally, tip-down crescents, there were very few breaks. There was just a couple small bending breaks at the tips and 1 large bending break on a wing. Here's another example of some of the crescents used tip-up as projectiles. Note the small, large bending and burin fractures, and an edge bite out of one of them that's very closely matches one of Tadlock's that he had in his sample. But if you look at the top one here, you'll note that burin fracture that removed a wing and runs down the convex margin is almost identical to the burin fracture seen on that archaeological specimen. So what I did here was I took before and after pictures, and then I adjusted the contrast on the before pictures and dropped them behind them so you can really see the change. So archaeological specimens typically exhibit margin abrasion at the midsection, bending and burin fractures at the tips and wings. And that's exactly what happened when the crescents were used tip up as projectiles. I ground the margins to prevent them from cutting the sinew, and then you get bending and burin fractures at the tips and wings. So to interpret these results, remember I'm saying that functional traits are selected for, and they correspond to the performance constraints for the task at hand. And as many ways as there are to make some tools that work, there are many more ways to make those that do not work. So these are viewed as competing technologies, and if one tool performs a task better than another, the tool that performs the task more efficiently should be selected for. Efficiency is defined as effectiveness, so effectiveness being the amount of leather cut, willow scraped, or their accuracy, compared to the cost, and cost being manufacturing costs. Flakes having low manufacturing costs, and crescents and western stem points having higher manufacturing costs. So the effects of selection should cause the frequency of inefficient tool forms to decrease and ultimately disappear. So In terms of thinking about crescents as cutting and slicing tools, the flakes cut 5 times as much leather per minute than the handheld crescents, and the hafted flakes cut 6 times as much leather than the hafted crescents. The breaks on the replicated crescents are small bending and burin fractures and do not encompass the full range of breaks exhibited by the archaeological specimens. Flakes are more effective and less costly to manufacture, and therefore they are more efficient and should have been favored by processes of selection. So, thinking about the primary function of crescents was used for cutting and slicing tasks is not supported by my results. So the function of crescents for scraping plants, the flakes and crescents were equally effective at scraping the willow handheld, and the hafted flakes were slightly more effective. And also the replicated tools display willow residue on their margins, and archaeological specimens do not display any sickle sheen. None of the replicated crescents used for scraping willow broke. They all remain complete and do not match the archaeological examples. So flakes are equally effective to crescents and less costly to manufacture. Therefore, flakes are more efficient, and they should have been favored by processes of selection. So the function of crescents for use for scraping plants is not supported. For skipping, both the crescents and the western stem points do not skip. However, ethnographic accounts indicate skipping a projectile across the surface of the water is an effective technique for hunting waterfowl. Inupiat and Yupik hunters would do an underhand throw, and they could get a dart to skip up to 25 meters. And also duck arrows in the Great Basin, there's ethnographic accounts of shooting an arrow in front of the duck so it would hit the water, glance up, and strike it in the breast. So these accounts suggest 2 things. Skipping projectiles across the surface of the water is possible, and because my experimental ones failed to do so, my design or experiment made it flawed, and I absolutely believe this to be the case. A good flex for a dart is between 5 to 7 pounds of flex. Mine were a little stiff, and a dart that's too stiff will cause the proximal end to kick up while the distal end kicks down. Compared to a dart that's too flexible, the proximal end will kick down while the distal end kicks up. So it's a fine balance, and if I had that balance right, I believe that they would have approached the water more parallel to it instead of at the angle that they did. So I believe that if designed and thrown correctly, projectile points that skipped across the water and crescents would have increased hunter success rates. So crescents offer the functional advantage of skipping. This really needs further experimentation. So the function of crescents as projectile points. They were slightly less accurate than western stem, but the results are not statistically significant. And I believe that being the case that my darts were too stiff, the western stem points were about 3 times as heavy as the crescents. And so that center of mass, the balance point where if you were to hold the dart on your finger, the center of mass should always be forward to the midpoint. But as you have a heavier projectile tip, it's going to move further up toward the distal end. So the heavier western stem points, I believe, are the reason that there's that variation in the accuracy. But did successfully demonstrate that there's really no difference in accuracy between the crescents and western stem points. Breaks on crescents used as projectiles produce the entire range of breaks exhibited by archaeological specimens. Both crescents and western stem points have high production costs, and both hit the target with equal accuracy, and therefore they're equally efficient for use as projectile tips. And furthermore, crescents do offer some functional advantages for hunting waterfowl that should have been favored by processes of selection. So when it comes to the primary function of crescents as used as transverse projectile points, this is supported. So some of the functional advantages that crescents offer can be, we can turn to modern archers, which use a variety of point types depending on their quarry. Some bird points have broad loops of wire or really wide blades, and these increase the chances of hitting a bird. And so a projectile tipped with a crescent would increase your chances of hitting a small target more than a western stem point, and allowing you to bring home a bird in hand more often than not. Blunt points further offer a functional advantage of disabling prey with minimal tissue damage. So you don't want to use your big western stem point to hunt a waterfowl, because it's going to penetrate too deeply, it'll puncture organs, and it'll spoil the meat. You want a blunt point that'll stun it and shock it and save that meat. So in sum, the modern data suggests that when hunting birds and small game, the broader projectile tip increases the hunter's chance of success and limits the depth of penetration. On the left here is some examples of the modern points, so you can see that they're not designed to penetrate, and they give you a better chance of hitting a small target. On the right here are some of the replica scars that were in the plywood. You note that the tip-up crescent produced the widest scar, and that's really what would be coming down at a bird compared to the narrower western stem point. Also, the crescents did not penetrate the plywood very deeply, whereas the western stem point did. So, numerous hunter-gatherer groups do employ some version of blunt points, and blunt-tipped arrows for hunting birds are known from around the world. New to meat hunters carry several types of arrows: deer arrows, bandit points, bear arrows with stone points, and bird arrows with blunt points. The Yanomamo of the Amazon, they carry 5 different types of arrows, with different types for birds and terrestrial mammals. And then finally the Paiutes carried at least 4 different types of arrows: stone points for deer, and blunt points or sticks tied transversely for ducks and birds. So it's reasonable to assume that Paleo-Indians, like modern ethnographic hunters, likely carry different projectile types depending on the quarry that they were pursuing. Which would be obviously western stem points for larger game and transverse crescents for smaller game. Here's a few examples of some blunt points around the world. There's a metal historic point from Pope, a possible bird point and from Japan, foul point from medieval Europe, and a greasewood stick tied transversely that the Stillwater Paiute used. So, to drop a little Dunnel on you guys, functional classes may be expected to correlate directly with microenvironmental classes. So, since crescents are always found near relic lakes, wetlands, and coastal settings, and are absent in upland environments, we should expect their function to be related to processing or procuring wetland resources. While some members of groups focused on less predictable, higher-ranked resources such as large game, risk of starvation could be mitigated by other members of the group focusing on more predictable, lower-ranked resources such as waterfowl. Now, waterfowl, although considered a lower-ranked resource, bird meat and organs are some of the richest fats, proteins, vitamins, and minerals that you can get. And so their organs would especially have an effect on maternal and infant mortality rates and group demographics. So the ice sheets that covered Canada during the Terminal Pleistocene and Holocene prevented waterfowl from migrating up to their current locations, and instead millions utilized the lakes and wetlands of California and the Great Basin. Investment in a technology should relate to the amount of encounters with the resource. So the abundant waterfowl that terminal Pleistocene and Holocene foragers were encountering every day should have resulted or prompted a greater investment in technology to hunt waterfowl. And as the environment deteriorated and fewer waterfowl were encountered, there should have been reduced investment in the technology used to hunt waterfowl. And at the Middle Holocene, we see that either the need for crescents disappears or they are replaced by a less costly tool. But they fall out of the archaeological record when the pluvial lakes dry and waterfowl establish their breeding grounds further north. So to classify crescents, a significant amount of evidence supports the hypothesis that they served as transverse projectile points. However, a limited amount of contrary evidence has caused researchers to insist that their function remains a mystery. The solution is twofold. First, we need more stringent typological definitions. So we need to separate crescentics and crescent scrapers and some eccentrics for different functions from true crescents. Secondly, it's necessary to differentiate primary function from secondary function. I'm defining primary function as the function that the tool was intended for at the time of manufacture. So tools used for the primary function will be efficient for the task at hand and directly affect the fitness of the populations in which they occur. Compared to secondary functions are any subsequent task the tool is used for over the course of its use life. Tools used for secondary functions may not be the most efficient tool for the job, and their use may result from raw material shortages or convenience. So we know that the primary function of projectile points was used to tip projectiles. However, they're often used for secondary functions such as cutting or scraping. And so reuse of a crescent that was primarily used to tip a projectile would cause, it muddies the water a little bit. And we also know that Paiutes reused points that they found at sites. And there's ethnographic accounts of Paiute women picking up crescents and going and scraping willow with them. And so these secondary functions, these secondary uses are obscuring the original function, and is the reason that crescents seem like such a great mystery. So I argue that crescents were manufactured for use as a projectile point, but were often used for a variety of other points or other tasks over the course of their use lives. I argue the functional classification for crescents should be as transverse points. The implications of this reaffirms our ideas of Paleoneolithic groups in the West reliance on aquatic resources. Their specialized adaptation to lacustrine environments, crescents were a specialized tool to procure resources in that environment. A migration along the Pacific coast would have been by groups adapted to harvesting aquatic resources. And we see that the western U.S. has a well-documented alternative to Clovis. Its western stem points are coming in and contemporaneous with Clovis, and crescents are part of that toolkit. And so similarities in form between crescents from places like the Channel Island and the old riverbed, Black Rock Desert, suggest close typological, functional, and cultural affinities across a large expanse of the western United States. I didn't cite Justice at all in studying Spear and Arrow points in my paper. He's kind of a secondary source, but the fact that he includes crescents in his book really shows that they have a form that's made on a mental template, and they can look similar from all across the western U.S. And the only other tool in any toolkit, is projectile points, where you have the same form all across the vast expanse. So if you think about scrapers, drills, cores, burins, any other flake stone tool, they're all dissimilar from one to another, even within a site. Whereas crescents, being fine pressure flaked, have this form that the only analog is a projectile point. In conclusion, the results of my experiments indicate the primary function of crescents for cutting and slicing is not supported. Crescents were much less efficient than flakes, and the breaks do not match the range of breaks exhibited by archaeological specimens. The function of crescents for scraping plants is not supported. Crescents were less efficient than flakes, no breaks occurred, and the archaeological specimens do not exhibit any sickle sheen. And then finally, the function of crescents as transverse projectile points is well supported. They are equally accurate to western stem points. The breaks from use closely match the archaeological specimens. They do offer functional advantages for hunting birds, including the limiting penetration and greater chance of hitting your target. We know that hunters often carry different point types depending on their quarry, and blunt points are well documented from around the world. So I will conclude with this.
Dart 1, Cat 27. Hey, good shot, Bruce. That was a good one.
Oh,
Nice.
and in slow motion. Questions?